Hello and welcome to the Car Kerala channel. Welcome back to the third part of the ultimate guide for your Toyota steering and suspension. In this video, we're going to focus primarily on power steering, both electric and hydraulic. Before we get started, if you haven't done so already, consider subscribing to the channel. Give the video a thumbs up if you like it. Consider also following the channel on Instagram and Facebook for sneak peeks for future videos. And without further ado, let's dig right into this. Starting with the rack and pinion. Now, this is a rack and pinion. I'm going to explain how this works in a second. But there's primarily two styles of steering that Toyota have used. One of them is the good old gearbox. We haven't seen that for a very long time. So for our purposes, we're going to focus on the rack and pinion style. The rack and pinion is very simple, just like the name says. Rack, pinion. Very simple. When you turn your steering wheel, there is something called a steering shaft. Goes through your steering column, goes through a couple joints, comes here. You turn this, steering wheel turns. Very simple. However, you notice that there's two lines right here, two openings for two lines. This is a hydraulic power steering. So you notice the lines as well. The difference between the hydraulic and the electric, the hydraulic uses hydraulic pressure to assist in turning your wheel. The electric power steering uses an electric motor to assist. So basically, the electric rack and pinion will not have these two openings for the lines, will not have these lines. There will be nothing. It's just a good old manual gear. Now, let's dig right into the problems because there's quite a few things to cover here. We're going to first start with what connects to the rack and pinion. Steering columns, behind your steering wheel, there's a shaft that goes inside. That's your steering column. Now, Toyota Land, we don't really have a lot of problems with those. Few exceptions here and there where they make noise, but nothing really is falling apart. It's just wear and tear, slight movement. Nothing I am too concerned about or big enough where I would bring it up. Some highlights, some Venzas were notorious for steering column noise, but again, I've seen people drive them for years and years and nothing really happened other than the noise. So there's that. Some really old 4Runners like early 2000s, mid to late 90s, they had some issues with the bearings wearing out. But again, nothing crazy. You get a notchy feeling in the steering. Expensive to fix, but nothing crazy. Moving on. Very, very, very common with Toyotas is you turn the wheel, clunk, 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 clunk. I mean, this spreads across a lot of models starting right around 2002 and up. This is something called the steering intermediate shaft. It's a shaft that connects here. It has two yokes, two joints that makes noise. People think the steering wheel is going to fall apart. It's actually just a tiny little shaft that makes noise. It needs to be greased or replaced. Nothing I'm too concerned about. The only time you need to replace that shaft or do something about it, if it bothers you. If it doesn't bother you, pretend it's not there because nothing is coming apart. It's just two shafts that are hitting each other as they move. They're not going to wear out. I've seen people go, again, 200,000-300,000 miles without any issues. So why are we worried about it? If it bothers you, it would bother me. It would drive me nuts. It would make me park the car and never drive it. I would fix it. Otherwise, don't worry about it. Now we made our way from the steering wheel down to here. And let's talk about the hydraulic power steering. Hydraulic power steering works great. But the problem is, it has a fluid, and that fluid loves to leak. I mean, notorious on Toyotas with power steering leaks. It's just the way the cookie crumbles in this one. There's no way around it. Let's talk about some common leaks and some things you need to know about when it comes to power steering leaks. So let's picture this. All you see as a consumer is a reservoir. Everything else is buried down underneath, but let's dig into that a little bit. You got your reservoir. Your reservoir usually has two lines to it. One of them is a return line, one of them is a feed line. The feed line goes to the pump turns with the engine, pressurizes the fluid, fluid goes here, comes to here. As you turn the wheel, there's a valve that assists on each side that you need, and the excess fluid goes to the second line, goes back into the reservoir on the other hose. That's called the return line. And then there's the pressure line. The pressure line goes from here to the pump. The pump pressurizes the fluid through the pressure line into here. Now, the main problems you're gonna have with hydraulic stuff is leaks. There is not really much else. And if anybody tells you that, oh, your pump is making noise, or you used to have that old GM that always loves to have a whiny power steering pump, that's not the case with Toyotas. Unless you really hammer on that pump with low fluid and driving and it's whining and whining and whining for months and months, then it goes out. And if it does, again, if you ever have a power steering pump failure, you need to consider an original one, because they are very well made. Ridiculously expensive, by the way. So maybe look for an aftermarket one from a well-respected company, maybe with a good warranty. That might be a better option if you're on a budget. But really, if you have a power steering pump that failed on a Toyota that's not 30 years old, you did something wrong, because they just don't go out. I don't remember the last time I replaced a pump just because nothing's leaking and it's a bad pump. No, there's no such thing. They're really well made, people. That's the thing about them. Now, the most common leaks are not really the pump. I think I've seen one pump leak, and that was kind of an oddball one. The most common leaks are the rack and pinion. You see those two little rubber boots? Behind those rubber boots, and I wish I could take this apart, but then I would have to pay the ridiculously expensive price of this, and that wouldn't be so good. So there's two seals underneath this boot that keep the fluid inside the rack. These seals, they're rubber, they get old, they get brittle, they start leaking, fluid fills this boot, then starts seeping out, or the boot tears after a while because it gets pressurized and it bursts. Now, the most common car that leaks power steering every single time and super bad, I mean for the rack and pinion, unfortunately, is the 2004 to 2010 Toyota Sienna. They love to leak. I mean, it is so rare for me to go underneath one of these Siennas and not find this boot burst, or the rack's been replaced. And then some people will say, well, if the seal is leaking, why can't it take this apart, put the seal, and move on? Sure, you can do that. But the problem is, how many times are we going to do this? Now, you replace the seal, then the other side leaks. You replace this seal, then this gasket starts leaking. You replace that, then guess what? The seal is leaking again. You put it on, and it just keeps going back and forth until the inner tie rod goes. Now you're doing that, and you're just constantly working on your power steering at that point. You know what? If you're doing this yourself, sure, replace the seal. It's not costing you anything, just ruining one weekend and a few bucks in a seal. Sure, try it. If it works, great. If it doesn't, but if you're a consumer paying a shop to do this, most shops will tell you, we'll put the seal, but you're on your own, no warranty, because this is just one of those situations. If you can find a shop that warranties it, great, power to them. But when it comes to these, if they're leaking really bad, your best financial decision would be to replace the whole rack and pinion. Dealership prices, ridiculous. I mean, astronomical for the part. It's a very well made part though. I will say that. I have to say that because it's the truth. But most people are not willing to stomach well over $1,000 repair for a power steering rack and pinion. So if that's the case, shop aftermarket, but warranty is very important. because it would be horrible for you to, because it's still an expensive proposition, for you to replace this guy with an aftermarket, and then a year later it's leaking worse than the one you replaced. That's not good. Let's talk about the leaks though a little bit more. I want to see a burst boot, or a boot that has oil flat out leaking. I've seen people recommend rack and pinions. They just have a haze of oil. I think that's excessive. That, yes, it's leaking, but we're not quite there yet. By the time this thing gets all wet, now my reservoir fluid is dropping, I might be already gone. The car might be already gone. I traded it in, we moved on, life is good. So why are we doing this? And the biggest thing is, unless this fluid is the kind of leak that you start the car, giant puddle underneath the car immediately, and then 5 minutes later the reservoir is empty, I'm not too worried about it. I'll be honest with you, because I think I've seen one or two, again they were 2004, 2010 Siennas, but maybe I've seen one or two do that. Most of them, they don't do that. They just don't leak like that. It takes them years and years to come out of the boot, and then more years and years for you to see it actually drop on the reservoir. So why are we doing this to begin with? Don't waste your money. It's not worth it. Again, show me the leak. Show me the leak. If you see just slight wetness here, okay, now I know about it. Remember, every mechanic has to tell you all this stuff. Everything we see with your car, we have to tell you. It's your car, it's not mine. I am liable as a professional to tell you what's wrong with your car. But I am here on the other side telling you, you need to make the decision on your own. It's your car, your money, your decision. If there's not significant leak here, walk away. We're not doing nothing. It's as simple as that. Any leak in this area, I'm not worried about. This adjustment nut loves to leak, and you'll see all this wet. But you know what? I'm not worried about that either, because that's not a very high pressure point. Usually the seals are weak. This is a little stronger. This will take years for it to actually form a drop. But these guys, if they burst, we have a problem. But it's very rare. Another thing with the rack and pinions, there are a few out there that are very lucky and they never have to replace the rack and pinion. But then they have another problem, which we have seen. The original rack and pinions that are, say, 10, 15, 20 years old. There is a bushing here. Let me make sure you can see that. Yep. There's a bushing right here. This is where the rack mounts to the car. See, there's two holes. There's a bolt that goes through it. This wears out. And now you have wander and weave. This is what the term that in the industry. All of a sudden your car wants to jump right, jump left, and it's all over the place. When these bushings wear out, they do that, because now your steering is like turning on its own. The whole rack is moving left and right on its own. That's not as common, but again, with age, if it's the original rack and pinion, it's possible. So something I want you to know about. Another one that is super common for this bushing, actually, before I forget, first generation Sequoias, especially the older ones, like the very first 2-3 years, that bushing was sold separate. Notorious to go bad. I mean, it makes the truck handle just scary, especially on the highway. It's tiny little bushing. Take the rack, loosen it up, put it on. Very DIY. Life is good. That's the only one that is common, but everything else, not really that common. Another thing I'm going to talk about is tie rod and tie rod ends. Tie rod and tie rod ends join the club of the ball joints that we talked about in the previous video. I've never seen a Toyota tie rod go out. Maybe a 20 years old car, maybe, but not very common. There's only one exception to that, and this rack only comes with the inner tie rods. These are the inner tie rods. There are outer tie rods that go, just like you see in this picture. The outer tie rods spin here. There's a nut that goes here. That's actually how you do your toe adjustment from the alignment. The inner tie rod that is common to go out is actually on the electric steering, which we're going to talk about in a second. On 2006 to 2012 RAV4s, for some reason, they're super common. One thing I will tell you, if you own one of these RAV4s, again 2006 to 2012, Toyota does not sell inner tie rods separately. You gotta buy the whole thing. And the whole thing is gonna drill such a big hole in your pocket, you'll never even come near a dealer again. So that one, unfortunately, if you're on a budget, you're gonna have to go aftermarket because it's just ridiculous. I would go aftermarket at that point, knowing, yes, it's gonna fail early, blah, blah, blah. But compared to the cost of the whole rack, go aftermarket, seriously. They don't make it. It just doesn't come separate from the rack. So outer tie rods, though, always come separate on every single model. And if for whatever reason you have one that's bad, it's probably aftermarket, or the car is very old, because they're not common at all. If you have it, please replace it with an original. They're actually not expensive, and they're very comparable in price to aftermarket, so why are we going aftermarket? I just don't understand the need to go aftermarket sometimes, even if the price is $1 or $2 more for the original. Doesn't make sense. Doesn't make sense to me. Maybe it does to somebody. I would love to understand the logic of that. Now let's talk a little bit about electric power steering. The beauty of electric power steering, actually. Electric power steering has no fluid, so there's no leaks. Beautiful. There are a couple things about power steering, electric power steering. The way they feel when you're driving, they're kind of numb and weird, but again, we're not driving a Ferrari here. It's an awesome car for everyday use. They handle very sharp, especially the newer ones. I think for a family car, for a normal, reliable, everyday car. But if you're a car enthusiast, that might bother you. But unfortunately, Toyota is going all electric power steering. Actually, the first car that started with electric power steering is 2006 RAV4. Today, only the trucks have hydraulic power steering. Everything else have electric. Electrics are bulletproof. We really have no problems with them. We've seen some problems with the column-mounted motor going loose. You'll hear like a very loud noise when you turn, especially on some of the newer Priuses. But not very common enough for me to really make it a sticking point, but just letting you know in case you run into it. Another thing we've seen like a herd of those, and then it disappeared. Oil leak from the, oil leaks right on your foot as you sit in the driver's seat. That electric pump has oil in it to lubricate it, and that seemed to leak. That was a very early problem, not something I expect anybody to see, but in case you see that, it's the electric motor leaking oil, and to be honest, I'm not too worried about it, because the ones we've seen have dripped couple, and then we've never seen them again, so why are we even worried about that, right? Last but not least, let's go back to the leaks of the hydraulic one, because that's the most problematic one. Let's talk about lines real quick. Actually, this happens to be a super common power steering leak line. This is the return line. You remember we talked about the return line? This one connects to the reservoir right here, goes to the front, then it loops back and goes all the way to the rack and pinion. This one is super common to leak. This is called the power steering return line, I think number 2 or number 1, and whatever. The names are weird in the parts. Here's a rule of thumb for power steering line leaks. 3 things. Number 1, if your pressure hose, and unfortunately I don't have a pressure hose to show you, if the high pressure hose is leaking, it needs to be replaced as soon as possible. Some of them are ridiculous expensive original, maybe look at aftermarket, but just know that aftermarkets, if you buy a cheap one, it might not be good, might burst very early. Because as the name says, high pressure line. High pressure lines obviously have high pressure. They're a lot more prone to just blowing up and leaking all the fluid all over the place. Anything other than the high pressure lines, I am not extremely worried about unless it gets very bad. This is not a high pressure line. This is just a little rubber hose. It's not high pressure. When this leaks, it's usually because of 2 things. This line right here, if you live in the beautiful city of Chicago or anywhere in the Rust Belt, this line right here corrodes, it breaks, it starts leaking. At that point, replace the whole thing and be done with it. Don't wait for it. Don't keep driving and adding fluid, and then you keep hammering on that power steering pump, and eventually that goes, and now we're going into this whole snowball effect. The other reason these leak is this rubber part. It gets brittle over time. These clamps, they can't hold anymore, they leak. I see people all the time take this clamp, put a worm clamp, and tighten it very tight. Don't do that. That's not a repair, that's a patch. I'm not in the business of mending cars, I'm in the business of fixing cars the right way. Replace the line. These lines are not very expensive. If they're too expensive for you, get one aftermarket. It's just a metal pipe with a little hose. I don't see the reason why you need to buy this original, but the originals are nice because they come perfectly molded. They have the right clamps. If the price is right, sure, go for it. Otherwise, it's just a metal pipe with a hose. Just get it aftermarket if it's a lot cheaper. Now, one common mistake I see, and this actually applies to everything. We might talk about this in a future series, but I'm going to say this. This clamp, this style clamp, I want to make sure you see it right. This is not a cheap quality clamp. Always use these clamps for power steering. Don't use worm clamps. Worm clamps are fixed as the pipe or the hose warms up, cools down, it's going to expand and contract. This style clamp will expand and contract with it. Worm clamp, it's either going to be too loose where it's leaking, or it's going to be too tight where it's going to cut the hose. That's my professional opinion. Some people might disagree with that, but these clamps are like $2 each, and usually last the life of the car. So I wouldn't use worm clamps. I've seen people use 3 worm clamps here just to hold the thing from leaking. Well, why don't you just replace this little hose if you're really trying to fix it? Because that's the problem of the leak. So power steering leaks, let's recap. High pressure hoses, you got to take care of them. Aftermarket, original, that's up to you. Because the original ones are very expensive, I'll admit. But anything non-high pressure, I'm not too worried about it. Still needs to be fixed. You gotta watch the fluid though. When you have an active leak, whether it's from the rack or from any of these lines, you gotta start watching the fluid. You don't want to run the pump low. And even though the pump is stout and it'll take a beating, you don't want to beat it unnecessarily. Come on, let's take care of our Toyotas. So that's gonna be a wrap for today's video, for this part at least. We still have one more part coming up for this series. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. Consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. May the Lord bless you and keep you, and you have a wonderful day.